Now that we've finished learning about how hydrogen bonding explains many of water's behaviors, it's time to actually look at what we use water for in the human body. The first function we're going to discuss is water's behavior as a solvent, which, as we remember from the chemistry review, means that we use water in order to dissolve certain substances. And remember, the substance that dissolves in a solvent is what we call a solute, such as the NaCl, the table salt we see here dissolving, and we can also look at the nutrients that make this kiwi sweet, that of course being sugar. So the reason why water is able to dissolve both NaCl and sugar is that both of these solutes are hydrophilic, meaning that they are both polar substances that are able to attract to water either through ion dipole attraction or hydrogen bonding, allowing water to pull them apart and cause them to dissolve. If, however, you were to eat a hydrophobic substance, something that is nonpolar, such as oil, cholesterol, or any high fatty food, this substance is not able to dissolve in water, meaning that we would need a nonpolar solvent in order to dissolve those. Now, all of this talk of food is very important because one of the major roles of water as a solvent is dissolving all of the nutrients that you get from the food that your digestive system breaks down, and most of this begins with the stomach. So the stomach has a large reservoir of water with acid that is dissolved in it, and the main function of this is actually to dissolve the nutrients in food after the food has been digested, so that the nutrients are then able to be transported throughout the body using your circulatory system, and transportation, as it happens, is the second major function of water. So when we discuss the circulatory system, the main thing that most people would think of is your blood, because that's the part of your circulatory system that is constantly moving, and as it happens, most of your body's water is actually found in your blood, and it is this blood that circulates throughout the body that transports all of the nutrients from your digestive system to everywhere in the body where they need to be. Now, one of those locations is actually the muscular system, because your muscles in the body require a large amount of energy in order to move, but that's not actually what we're going to be talking about here. The third function of water that we're going to talk about is the process of lubrication. So if lubrication is the noun form of this word, you'll recognize that the verb form of this word is to lubricate, which is the scientific way of saying that we want to keep something wet. Now, keeping these locations in the body completely wet is very important. Now, any location that is able to bend like this, anytime that we have an intersection of multiple bones in the body, this is what we call a joint. Now, joints are very important to keep wet, because if we were to keep the elbow joint dry here, that would mean the upper arm bone and the two lower arm bones would be grinding up against each other, which is going to cause a lot of friction. And if you have a large amount of friction, a large amount of the grinding energy that you produce is going to generate heat, which can damage the bones against each other, as well as the muscles and all of the skin around the joint. But if we keep your joints wet, it allows the two bones to move up against each other while minimizing the amount of friction that exists between the movable surfaces. Now, the next function that we're going to talk about involves us looking at your nervous system. So the nervous system is the control center of the human body, and again, of pretty much any organism's body. The primary organ of the nervous system, of course, is the brain, and the brain basically relies on sending a large number of electrical signals to everywhere else in the body in order to tell them what to do. And lo and behold, your brain needs a large amount of water, because the water functions as what we call an electrical conductor. Electrical conductors, if you remember from any electricity unit, allows an electrical current to be able to pass through it. So how exactly can water do this? Well, we know that water is able to dissolve ionic compounds, and of course the most common ionic compound in our body is good old NaCl. And when water dissolves NaCl into sodium and chloride ions, it causes the ion concentration in certain locations in the body to become very high, which allows an electrical current to be able to pass through it. And any substance that is able to pass an electrical current is said to have a high electrical conductivity, meaning once again that a current is able to pass through it. And your nervous system, all of the cells in your brain and all of the nerve cells that control the different parts of your body are all basically your body's electrical wiring system. And this is only possible because of water's ability to dissolve ions in order to give these cells a large concentration of positive and negative charge, which can then pass electricity through it. Now, if you remember from the previous video where we discussed water's specific heat capacity, remember that specific heat capacity is the measurement of how much energy a substance can absorb before its temperature increases by 1 degree. Now, this means that water is naturally a very effective form of temperature control, because not only does water have a very high specific heat capacity, meaning that water is able to absorb a lot of heat that we absorb, but the fact that the human body is approximately 70% water, this allows the human body to stabilize our temperature to around 37 degrees Celsius. But obviously, if you live in a hotter part of the world, this alone is not enough to keep the temperature stable, and most people are familiar with what happens to you and what our body uses water for when we get excessively hot. And this, of course, is called sweating. So how sweat works is that, if we take a look at this equation here, in order for liquid water, which sweat definitely is, to be converted into gaseous water, the water is actually going to absorb heat from the environment, and then when the water turns into water vapor, when it evaporates, it takes this heat that our body absorbs and takes it away from the body, therefore having a cooling effect. And this effect is what we call evapotranspiration. I'll say that word again, evapotranspiration, which again is most commonly known as sweating, which we use in order to lower the human body's temperature. And again, this is simply because sweat absorbs any heat, and when the sweat evaporates, and that's where we get the word evapotranspiration from, the heat that is absorbed by the water in order to cause it to evaporate is removed. Now, for people that have a strong chemistry background, this is what we call an endothermic reaction. So endo is a prefix that means inside, and thermic tells us that we're dealing with some sort of heat, meaning that heat is going into this reaction because water is absorbing heat, and then when the water evaporates, it takes the heat, it takes the absorbed heat away and causes your skin temperature to decrease, therefore having an evaporative cooling effect. And this would literally kill you if it did not happen. Now, the next function of water we're not going to talk about because it's a very complex chemical reaction, which is what we call hydrolysis. There's an entire video that we're going to devote to this reaction here, but at the very least we can talk about what it means. So hydro we recognize as the prefix for water, and lysis as in the word analysis, where you break down a word in order to understand its meaning, literally means to break or to split. So this is a chemical reaction in which water is added to a specific molecule and causes larger molecules to break into multiple smaller molecules, but we will be revisiting this in a future video. Now, the final example of how water is important concerns not specifically us, but we're going to look to our aquatic friends, that being organisms that live underwater in specifically northern environments that are very, very cold, where you can get ice and liquid water forming at the same time. And we'll see how water, both in the liquid and the solid forms, prevent organisms from freezing and allows them to survive in very northern environments. So the first phenomenon that we can see is that ice is actually floating on top of water, and for those that don't know this, the reason why this occurs is because ice has a much lower density than water does, which causes the ice to float. Now, how does this help to keep the aquatic organisms alive? Well, let's think about, as I'm conveniently changing the color of my pen, let's think about where the heat that keeps water in liquid form comes from. Usually it comes from some sort of heat source, such as an underground volcano that I'm drawing here. So here we can see our underwater volcano is erupting, and as it erupts, it's going to transfer heat upward. However, when it hits the ice, most heat does not actually pass through the ice. It's actually reflected back down into the water, and it's the idea that ice is acting as a natural insulator or natural insulation in order to keep the heat trapped inside the water, and because this heat cannot escape past the ice, it causes the water underneath to stay liquid and allows our fish here to stay happy because they're alive, as opposed to becoming unhappy because they are dead, because they've frozen to death. Now that we've finished reviewing or learning about the different functions of water, take a look at some of the practice problems, starting with this case study here, and see if you can connect the importance of the functions of water and rationalize what actually causes us to die when we don't get enough of it.